Greetings, my name is Chris Sweeney, and I am reaching out to labor unions who are identified on Davis-Bacon wage determinations, where the labor unions and the contractors of those unions uh, have been disadvantaged. The Department of Labor narratives I have read so far essentially says when there's a union rate identifier to reach out to the union for the proper classification of work. So my former employer, Acro Construction, would have a policy that everybody was treated as a laborer even though they did not have a bona fide apprenticeship program for the first 90 days of employment. Now, this was mainly using day laborers through staffing companies where I would bring people in through the staffing companies as I wasn't able to let people stay on with us unless I reclassified them as laborers for every project. Most of the projects I did were very fast-paced projects where I would not be on the project for 90 days. Sometimes there would be a delay in the project and I'd have to bring somebody over from the staffing company payroll to ours, and since they're a new employee, they're reclassified as a laborer, the lowest wage rate they can do that. This gets to be an issue for the labor unions and the contractors that use unions. Let's just say most of our work was mechanical based work. So in one area where pipe fitters were making close to $80 an hour, we would travel from Florida and Georgia and go to this higher prevailing wage area, and none of us made the prevailing wage for that project. Two people were classified as salary, where they didn't even report uh, the salary rate, and another person was an independent contractor who billed less than that $80 an hour rate for the pipe fitters. That was a project where 26 different contractors bid on the work. And of course, the low bidder got the job, but this was all done um, through this labor scheme where they don't want to classify people as doing the work that they're actually doing. The tools, the craft classification they were using to do the work, and basically would have people with laborer wages doing journeyman level work. This happened across about 30 different federal projects. Not all of them Davis-Bacon Act projects, but reaching out to the labor unions where the Davis-Bacon Act wages apply uh, will help the process with attorneys involved now and stuff to narrow this down, because the company will say, well, hey, that person's only doing apprenticeship level work. They don't, deserve anything but the laborer rate. Um, so it disadvantages the contractors that do uh, work as they're supposed to on these federal contracts. They actually have an apprenticeship program where, typical apprenticeship program, let's say each state is different or different way that it's done through the federal government, says that for every 3 journeymen you have working, you can have 1 apprentice. Well, the exact opposite happened with Acro Construction. We would have 1 journeyman working for every 3 apprentice level workers, um, and they would all be classified as labor. Of course, when the Department of Labor investigates this stuff, all they do is look at the certified payrolls. They don't go back to the timesheets to see how people were actually paid. For instance, they classified me as salary most of the time, but I had to work minimum 50-hour weeks. I had to transfer hours from week to week to save up for a week off before I got any extra compensation. Um, so their labor schemes, basically, they for 2 decades of records I have so far, they've been doing these labor schemes for a long time. Um, a lot of this previously was done around asbestos work where they were proposed for federal debarment. because they were basically paying off an Air Force official, bribing them, and would not have real containments. Then they would also own the company that transported the asbestos material and would take it to a landfill that wasn't registered to receive it. And because they're not paying $200 a ton, they were making money off of that where they actually owned the landfill as well. This was a surprise in deposition when I asked the owner of Acro Construction if he had got an asbestos financial officer certification that the state of Florida requires, and he lied under oath and said no. Of course, you can go to the Florida Department of Division of Corporations, what's called SunBiz, look up Billy Tolson, and find that he did, in fact, twice have his chief financial officer for asbestos certification. Um, so this kind of ties in that old labor scheme where they were classifying dozens of people as salary, and they were doing asbestos work on a federal contract on a U.S. Air Force facility. So a lot of people that live in the Panama City area and work at Tyndall Air Force Base or Eglin Air Force Base may be familiar with this scheme that was going on back then. When they were proposed for federal debarment, uh, it listed a whole bunch of people, and the owner of the company closed down his hidden company and started Acro Construction with the chief financial officer of the main company involved in that federal debarment proceeding. So this is a long operating scheme that's been going on decades, and getting to the labor unions and saying, hey, getting the explanation, hey, if somebody's pooking ductwork, then yeah, they're also being a sheet metal mechanic if they're insulating it. I know insulators are treated differently in different areas of the country. Most areas of the country, if somebody is insulating pipe, they get the pipe fitter wage. If they're insulating ductwork, they get the sheet metal wage. Some areas of the country have their own rate identifier for insulators, and usually it's higher than the sheet metal rate, for instance. So they would classify everybody I had doing insulation as laborers. So another instance is when we had a project where 80% of the work was doing ductwork. I did the ductwork. I spent 80, 90 hours a week doing the ductwork, but there was 5 or 6 people on that project doing ductwork that we were paying 17 to $20 an hour on average that should have been making that $50 plus an hour wage. And this directly takes away from the unions, their workers, and the contractors that actually abide by the law, have apprenticeship programs, and go from there. So this spans about 30 different contracts, and I have set up an email address, and let me just make something for that email address real quick. Um, the email address is acrolaborfraud at gmail.com. So if you see my name's Chris Sweeney post to Facebook the union thing, that means that you are on a wage determination and that we had self-performed work where it took away from the labor union area. Uh, that's pretty significant because it's a lot of money over a long period of time. So I am going to try to put that a little bigger on the screen so you guys can see it well. So acrolaborfraud at gmail.com. This was their policy, and this goes essentially to the 90 days classification for somebody, just like you would uh, a pre-apprentice. Uh, Somebody who's actually going into the apprenticeship program and you have an apprenticeship program is basically how they treated everybody on their first 90 days. Uh, there'd be instances where I hired somebody to do concrete work, and concrete work paid $18 an hour, and the labor rate was $17 an hour. So I would separate their time and give them the concrete rate for when they're doing concrete work. But the rest of the time when they're doing labor work, they're actually doing sheet metal duct work where they should have been making $50 an hour or more. Uh, Going through the wages, I've also noticed that when timesheets were submitted, that they would move hours between one federal project and another when they were worked in the same week, where they would have to pay less overall because they would remove hours off the higher paying prevailing wage project to the lower paying just to cheat somebody out of 20 something dollars. There's numerous instances where they just literally took time off the timesheet altogether. And this is especially true when it came close to somebody working overtime or when they worked a lot of overtime would take that off. They also had policies of um, not paying, anything but $20 an hour. I mean, $20 a day for per diem, where that would cover the meals and incidentals that generally ranged from $49 to $79 a day, depending on the area of the country you're at. Of course, they always passed over the hotel bill. Or sometimes when we hired through these staffing companies, they would negotiate for the whole week. So those that were not treated fairly on that were also had that burden when they were traveling for work. So this is just the beginning. I've got to go through and separate the scope of work to the man hours that were put performing this stuff. But for our self-performance of work, it's more than 80% of the time was misclassified to a lower wage rate than the journeyman pay that these people should have got for the work that they were doing. Especially when negotiations were made where, hey, we didn't try, you know, we didn't wouldn't pay for training time. So there's a lot of stuff that this company did that was illegal. And once again, I look forward to talking to you. If you get this video, that means I will be reaching out. I've got to go through the Office of the Inspector General for each contract after I go through the scope of work and explain how many people were not paid the wages that they should have got because we basically used people misclassified as laborers to do journeyman level work for a good 80% of the self-performance, which was way more than half of the total man hours on a project for all trades. So this is not just inclusive of pipe fitters and sheet metal mechanics and insulators. Other people with the company would do electrical work on three-phase, um, three-phase electrical work. So it affects the electrical unions. Um, there's it, carpentry work that was paid as labor. There was tile setting that was paid as labor. There was a lot of this stuff. I believe there's close to 200 people that were misclassified for the lower wages, whether they were classified as salary or whatnot. However, there's a lot to go through. And I've got to report these all individually for eventually going through a False Claims Act. And if you have an attorney looking at this that might know, there's a case called USX Rel Wall versus Phase Tech and CC Construction. And essentially, that in that case, it's a federal False Claims Act where this labor kickback scheme occurred. However, I worked directly for the prime contractor, and prime contractor self-performed a lot of this mechanical work and other construction work. It wasn't just mechanical. Um, and it was the prime contractor themselves that operated this scheme, and their main way of operating the scheme was to make it harder for people to recover because the Miller Act when you got a staffing company. But it is a racketeering scheme that they have been had going on for years. Uh, I was intimidated at first to report it because There's a part of me that said that this was wrong when I was doing it. However, I was going by the guidelines that you see on this page where it explains, this new probationary employees stuff. This stuff. If this was purposeful and is operated by um, everybody who profit shares with the company. Lorenzo Alvarez through Alvarez Inc., Alan Cooper through Cooper Mechanical, and of course Billy Tolson through Acro Construction. The person who does the certified payrolls for the company also would get would be the ones that would be manipulating these hours from week to week. That person, I think, is paid on a salary basis and doesn't make a profit share, but it shows that she was willingly doing this. And the fact that they actually just removed hours off of timesheets, and then all they have to show the Department of Labor is the certified payrolls, makes it where they already knew that that was the process, and they manipulated the certified payrolls and did not keep accurate timesheet records. That's the best explanation I have for now, and I look forward to talking to you guys. If you receive this by email, please feel free to reach out. Once again, this will be coming from acrolaborfraud@gmail.com. Thank you.